A drunk drive to a liquor store, a knife in a Chelsea hotel bathroom, 23 stab wounds in an Oslo stairwell. These aren't scenes from fiction. They're real events linked to some of rock's biggest names. Behind the fame, certain rock stars crossed a line that changed everything. Violence, death, and controversy became part of their legacy, long after the music stopped. So let's dive in. Rock stars who killed people, starting with a case whose outcome still divides opinions today. December 8th, 1984, a date that would haunt two rock bands for the rest of their existence. That night, a trip to the liquor store turned into a fatal car wreck that killed one musician, gave two strangers permanent brain damage, and left the driver, one of glam metal's most recognizable frontmen, with a jail sentence that amounted to less than 3 weeks behind bars. During their first US tour in 1984, members of Hanoi Rocks set up camp at Motley Crue singer Vince Neil's home, near Redondo Beach, for a few days of relaxation and partying. The Finnish glam rock band was riding a wave of momentum. After finally netting a major label deal with CBS, the band had just delivered Two Steps from the Move, their fifth and most assured studio album to date. They were preparing to take America by storm. Motley Crue, meanwhile, was already one of the biggest bands on the Sunset Strip, and the two groups celebrated together in the way that rock bands of that era often did, with round-the-clock excess. Sketchy memories from those in attendance suggest that 3 to 4 days into the party, on the evening of December 8th, with supplies depleted, a trip to buy more booze was mooted. Vince Neil, heavily intoxicated, set off for the liquor store with Razzle as his passenger. Neil had just purchased a bright red vintage 72 Ford de Tomaso Pantera and was eager to show it off. Neil later wrote that he had been driving drunk for about as long as he'd been driving, and that it had never been a problem before. He claimed the cocaine he was using evened things out. The car didn't have a back seat, so after they loaded up at the store, Razzle held hundreds of dollars worth of alcohol in his lap. What happened next changed everything. While speeding and driving drunk, Neil lost control of his car and swerved around a stationary fire truck at 65 miles per hour in a 25 miles per hour speed zone. Neil lost control and plowed into an oncoming car, killing Razzle and seriously injuring the two occupants of the other vehicle. The impact was catastrophic. Razzle was rushed to the hospital and pronounced dead at 7:12 p.m. He had died instantly in the collision. Nicholas Charles Dingley, better known by his stage name Razzle, was an English musician and the drummer of the Finnish glam rock band Hanoi Rocks from 1982 until his death in 1984. He was just 24 years old, but Razzle was not the only victim. The driver of one of the other cars, 18-year-old Lisa Hogan, was rushed in critical condition to the intensive care unit, where she remained in a coma for about a month, with a broken arm, 2 broken legs, and brain damage that left her liable to psychomotor seizures. Her passenger, 20-year-old Daniel Smithers, suffered a broken leg and brain damage as well. 2 young people, total strangers to the rock and roll world, had their lives permanently altered by a decision that took seconds to make. Andy McCoy and Motley Crue drummer Tommy Lee had gone looking for Neil and Razzle. They drove by the crash site and saw Neil handcuffed and placed in a police car. They were informed that Razzle had been taken to a hospital, where he was pronounced dead. Hanoi Rocks guitarist Andy McCoy later recalled, "Then I saw Razzle's hat on the street." Vince Neil was taken to the police station at nearby Torrance, where he was immediately arrested on suspicion of drunken driving and vehicular manslaughter, but was subsequently released on $2,500 bail. Neil clocked up an alcohol reading of 0.17, well above the legal limit of 0.10. To make matters worse, neither he nor Razzle were wearing seatbelts at the time of the crash. And then came the sentencing, which remains one of the most controversial outcomes in rock history. Eventually convicted in July 1985, the singer ultimately served just 20 days in jail, was ordered to pay $2.6 million in compensation to the injured parties, completed 200 hours of community service, and attended lectures on the dangers of drugs and alcohol. Years later, Neil himself acknowledged the absurdity of the punishment. He said, "I wrote a $2.5 million check for vehicular manslaughter when Razzle died. I should have gone to prison. I definitely deserve to go to prison. But I did 30 days in jail and got laid and drank beer, because that's the power of cash." The fallout for Hanoi Rocks was devastating. Razzle's death was a turning point for the band. Razzle was initially replaced by ex-Clash drummer Terry Chimes. Lead singer Michael Monroe gave the band notice early in 1985, and the group broke up in May after a farewell concert. A band that was on the verge of global stardom simply ceased to exist. Despite his short career, Razzle left an impact through his work with Hanoi Rocks, a band credited as a major influence on Guns N' Roses and other glam metal acts of the late 80s. Singer Michael Monroe apparently never forgave Neil. There was an accident, and unfortunately, our drummer was killed, the Hanoi Rocks frontman said in 2011. As far as Vince Neil, I have nothing to say. It was an accident. What happened happened, and it can't be changed. The timing of the tragic accident, December 8, 1984, marked the first day of the USA's National Drunk Driving Awareness Week. The irony of that detail has not been lost on anyone. Neil dedicated Theater of Pain, Motley Crue's third studio album, to Razzle. But no dedication could undo what had been done. A man was dead. 2 people would live with brain damage for the rest of their lives, and the man responsible served fewer days in jail than most people spend on a holiday. If Vince Neil's case was a tragedy of recklessness, the next story is a tragedy wrapped inside a mystery that has never been solved. On the morning of October 12, 1978, the body of 20-year-old Nancy Spungen was found on the bathroom floor of room 100 at Manhattan's Chelsea Hotel. The man she shared that room with, Sex Pistols bassist Sid Vicious, was charged with her murder. But to this day, the question of what actually happened in that room remains one of punk rock's most enduring unsolved cases. Nancy Laura Spungen was the American girlfriend of English musician Sid Vicious and a figure of the 1970s punk rock scene. Born and raised in Philadelphia, Spungen was an emotionally disturbed child who was diagnosed with schizophrenia at age 15. After being expelled from college, she moved to New York City and became a stripper, known for being a groupie. She flew to London in December 1976 at the height of the punk rock movement, where she became involved with Vicious, the bassist for the Sex Pistols. Vicious was born in England and endured a peripatetic childhood with a single, drug-abusing mother. Spungen was born in a comfortable Philadelphia suburb, but proved too volatile for conformity. 2 damaged people drawn together by the gravitational pull of punk rock's most chaotic orbit. Sid and Nancy first met in London in 1977. After Sid had replaced Glenn Matlock as the Sex Pistols bass guitarist, Nancy was a groupie who had traveled from New York to follow Johnny Thunders and Jerry Nolan of the Heartbreakers. The pair immediately became an item, fueling each other's drug addiction. Their relationship was tumultuous, characterized by domestic violence, substance abuse, and heroin addiction. The other members of the Sex Pistols despised Spungen, as the Pistols improbably thrashed their way into the mainstream, riding the turbulent wave of singles like God Save the Queen. Vicious and Spungen became inseparable. The couple sank deeper into heroin use, isolating themselves from nearly everyone around them. After the Sex Pistols imploded in January 1978, following their final show in San Francisco, Spungen and Vicious relocated to New York City, where they lived in room 100 at the Hotel Chelsea, registered as Mr. and Mrs. John Simon Ritchie, Vicious' real name. The Chelsea Hotel had housed legends, Bob Dylan, Patti Smith, Jackson Pollock, but for Sid and Nancy, it became the stage for the final act of their doomed relationship. By this point, Spungen was acting as Vicious's manager, along with getting him gigs in her old Lower East Side haunts. She served as Vicious's spokesperson when he was too stoned to communicate. The couple's life revolved almost entirely around drugs, a revolving door of dealers, hangers-on, and shady characters, filtered in and out of room 100 at all hours. Then came the night of October 11, 1978. On the night of 11 October 1978, Vicious and Spungen hosted a party in their hotel room, during which Vicious took approximately 30 Tuinal tablets and was comatose for the rest of the night while numerous people came and went. At about 11 a.m. the next day, hotel staff found Spungen dead on the bathroom floor, with a knife wound to her abdomen. She had suffered a stab wound to the abdomen. Vicious owned the knife that inflicted the injury, a Jaguar Wilderness K11 with a 5-inch blade. The murder weapon was identified as a Jaguar K11 hunting knife, which Spungen had purchased for Vicious a few days earlier. Vicious was found wandering the hallway. He first claimed to have killed her, then said he remembered nothing. Sid was the prime suspect in Nancy's murder, and although he initially said he had killed her, he retracted his statement and said he'd been passed out on the bed when the incident had occurred. The musician was arrested and charged with her murder. The question of whether Vicious actually killed Spungen has fueled debate for nearly 5 decades. Theories of who killed Spungen are still swirling to this day, and many suggest Sid Vicious was not responsible. Some wonder her stabbing was a robbery or drug deal gone bad, or perhaps that Spungen stabbed herself. In his 2007 book Pretty Vacant, A History of Punk, director Phil Strongman stated that he was convinced that it was actor Rocket's Redglare who killed Nancy Spungen, noting that Redglare not only knew about the large amounts of cash kept in the bedside table, but also brought the tuinal to the party. Redglare, who died in 2001, had publicly denied this, but privately confessed it to friends. Sex Pistols manager Malcolm McLaren protested Sid's innocence, saying he was capable of a wide range of self-destructive acts, but I didn't think that he could kill someone, especially his girlfriend, unless it was a botched double suicide. The world would never get a definitive answer. Freed on bail. Vicious was powerless to withstand the overwhelming loss in his life and attempted suicide a few days later. After spending 2 months in the Rikers Island prison complex, he celebrated his release in February 1979 by sending his mother to score some heroin. On the morning of February 20, the punk icon was discovered dead from an overdose. He was 21 years old. With Vicious dead, the police dropped Nancy Spungen's murder case. Their prime suspect was gone, and to them, it appeared pointless to pursue the case any further. Vicious's body was cremated at Garden State Crematory in New Jersey. If she could scatter Vicious's ashes over Nancy's grave, and Spungen said no. Regardless, Jerry only drove Beverly to Nancy's gravesite, where Beverly scattered Vicious's ashes. Even in death, the two remained inseparable, bound together by a story that has been retold in books, films, and songs ever since. In 1986, the film Sid and Nancy, directed by Alex Cox, was released, portraying the life of Vicious, played by Gary Oldman, and his relationship with Spungen, played by Chloe Webb. The film offered its own theory that the couple had a suicide pact. Others have pointed the finger at the drug dealers and drifters who haunted Room 100. The truth died with Sid Vicious on that February morning in 1979, and no amount of speculation has been able to resurrect it. From a crumbling punk hotel in New York, we move to a dark apartment stairwell in Oslo, Norway, where an entirely different kind of rock and roll killing took place. This was not an accident. This was not shrouded in mystery. This was a musician who drove hundreds of miles to another musician's apartment in the middle of the night and stabbed him 23 times. The killer's name is Varg Vikernes. His victim was his own bandmate. In August 1993, Vikernes fatally stabbed Mayhem guitarist Euronymous during an altercation at the latter's apartment, and was arrested shortly after. The murder sent shockwaves through the music world and became the defining event of the Norwegian black metal scene, a genre that had already been plagued by church burnings, hate crimes, and an atmosphere of escalating extremism. Born Christian Vikernes on February 11, 1973, in Bergen, Norway, Varg Vikernes had a relatively normal early life. His father was an electronics engineer and his mother worked for a large oil company. He had an older brother who became a civil engineer. But life for Vikernes fundamentally changed when he was about 6 years old, and his family temporarily moved to Baghdad, Iraq, for his father's work. By his teenage years, Vikernes had gravitated to the extreme fringes of Norway's heavy metal scene. A native of Bergen, Vikernes began playing guitar at the age of 14 and formed his first band, Kalashnikov, by 1989. He went on to join the band Old Funeral. He would later create Burzum, the one-man black metal project that became his primary vehicle for both music and ideology. The Norwegian black metal scene of the early 1990s was not like any other music community on Earth. At its center was Øystein Euronymous Arseth, the guitarist of Mayhem. Euronymous opened a record shop named Helvete, Norwegian for hell, in Oslo. Norwegian black metal musicians often met in the shop's basement, including the members of Emperor, Varg Vikernes of Burzum, and Snorre Blackthorn Rouge of Thorns. Euronymous also started an independent record label called Deathlike Silence Productions. He was, by most accounts, the gatekeeper and architect of the entire scene. Euronymous took Vikernes, who was 5 years younger than him, under his wing, inviting him to play bass with Mayhem and offering to release his music as Burzum. At first, it seemed like a partnership built on mutual interest, but the relationship between the two men began to corrode, poisoned by ideological differences, ego, money, and a swelling atmosphere of violence that permeated the entire scene. They had different ideologies. Arseth was a Satanist and a communist, whereas Vikernes was a pagan, a neo-Nazi, and a nationalist. It has been speculated that the murder was the result of a power struggle, a financial dispute over Burzum Records. Euronymous owed Vikernes a large sum of royalty payments, or an attempt at outdoing a recent stabbing in Lillehammer, committed by Emperor drummer Faust. After a few years of what can be seen as a superficial friendship and music partnership, the tension between Vikernes and Euronymous grew to an obvious issue. Those close to the Norwegian black metal scene agreed that the murder had ultimately been the result of a power struggle between the two, in reigning as the leader and originator of the underground black metal scene. Meanwhile, Norway itself was reeling. In 1992, Vikernes, along with other members of the scene, was suspected of burning down 4 Christian churches in Norway. The situation escalated when Vikernes, in a January 1993 interview with Bergens Tidende, admitted to church burnings and a murder. This bold declaration led to his arrest, and the ensuing police and media attention forced Euronymous to close his record shop, Helvete. Then came the final rupture. Vikernes claims that he killed Euronymous in self-defense. He says that Euronymous had plotted to stun him with an electroshock weapon, tie him up, and torture him to death while videotaping the event. Whether this was true, or a justification fabricated after the fact, remains a matter of fierce debate. On the night of the murder, Vikernes and Snorre Blackthorn Rouge drove from Bergen to Euronymous' apartment in Oslo. Blackthorn allegedly stood in the stairwell smoking while Vikernes went to Euronymous' apartment on the 4th floor. Vikernes said he met Euronymous at the door to hand him a signed contract, but when he stepped forward and confronted Euronymous, Euronymous panicked and kicked him in the chest. Vikernes claims Euronymous ran into the kitchen to fetch a knife. The two got into a struggle and Vikernes stabbed Euronymous to death. His body was found in the stairwell on the 1st floor, with 23 stab wounds. 2 to the head, 5 to the neck, and 16 to the back. The sheer number of wounds, and the fact that the vast majority were to the back, made Vikernes' self-defense claim extremely difficult to accept at face value. After the murder, Vikernes and Blackthorn drove back to Bergen. On the way, they stopped at a lake where Vikernes disposed of his blood-stained clothes. Vikernes was arrested on the 19th of August, 1993 in Bergen. The police found 150 kilograms of explosives and 3,000 rounds of ammunition in his home. In May 1994, Vikernes faced the full weight of the law. He was convicted of first-degree murder, church arson, and possession of explosives. He was sentenced to 21 years in prison, the maximum sentence allowed under Norwegian law. Although the exact cause of the feud is murky, Vikernes was released in 2009 on parole. If anything, the whole incident made Vikernes even more popular among black metal fans, and he still has a following and makes music to this day. Varg Vikernes walks free today and still releases music. The murder of Euronymous didn't just end a life. The events of August 10, 1993, plunged the black metal world into a dark, reflective state. Euronymous' murder by fellow musician Varg Vikernes not only ended a life, but also marked a turning point in the genre's history. It was a night where personal vendettas, ideological differences, and violence collided, culminating in a tragedy that would forever alter the black metal landscape. Norwegian society was shocked by Euronymous' death, bringing an underground music scene into the glaring spotlight. If Varg Vikernes' story is one of ideology and ego spiraling into violence, the story of Jim Gordon is something far more harrowing, a descent into madness that no one around him understood until it was too late. Gordon was not a fringe figure or a controversial provocateur. He was one of the most accomplished and in-demand session drummers in the history of rock and roll. And on June 3, 1983, he murdered his own mother. James Beck Gordon was an American musician, songwriter, and convicted murderer. Gordon was a session drummer in the late 1960s and 1970s, and played drums in the blues rock supergroup Derek and the Dominos. Gordon was a member of Clapton's band Derek and the Dominos, and is the credited co-writer of the classic 1970 hit Layla, and played on literally hundreds of songs as part of the elite group of session musicians known as the Wrecking Crew. He was also a member of Joe Cocker's Mad Dogs and Englishman band, and one of the main drummers on George Harrison's epical 1970 album All Things Must Pass. The list of artists he performed with reads like a who's who of 20th century music. Jim Gordon was the drummer in Derek and the Dominos, and was also known for performing alongside George Harrison, Joe Cocker, John Lennon, Steely Dan, Alice Cooper, the Beach Boys, and the Monkees. Gordon was a member of the Wrecking Crew, a famed group of Los Angeles-based session musicians who played on hundreds of hits in the 1960s and 70s. James Beck Gordon was raised in the San Fernando Valley of Los Angeles and attended Grant High School. He passed up a music scholarship to UCLA in order to begin his professional career in 1963 at age 17, backing the Everly Brothers. He went on to become one of the most sought-after recording session drummers in Los Angeles. He was a prodigy behind the kit, and by his early 20s, he was the first call drummer for sessions that produced some of the era's most iconic recordings. But beneath the surface, something was terribly wrong. Gordon developed schizophrenia and began to hear voices, including his mother's, which compelled him to starve himself and prevented him from sleeping, relaxing, or playing drums. His physicians misdiagnosed the problems and instead treated him for alcohol abuse. Jim's schizophrenia wasn't diagnosed before the murder because he was too high-functioning. He was carrying a professional career and making a lot of money. Doctors thought he was depressive. He had drug and alcohol problems and maybe a mood disorder. He was not diagnosed with schizophrenia until after the crime. The voice he heard most prominently was his mother's, but it was a twisted, distorted version of her, warped by the disease into something monstrous. Jim said he was crowded with voices, but the chief one was his mother. It was a very controlling, cynical, harsh voice. In real life, his mother was kind and warm, but also a bit controlling. The real Osa Gordon was a maternity nurse, active in the recovery community, who had kept the family together through her husband's alcoholism. But in Jim Gordon's fracturing mind, she became a figure of malice. The idea was presented to him by Osa's voice, "You'll just have to kill me." It led to an intense mental condition where he repeated the thoughts over again. The voices escalated, giving instructions, issuing commands, warping reality until the boundary between what was real and what was not ceased to exist. On June 3, 1983, Gordon attacked his 71-year-old widowed mother, Osa Marie Gordon, with a hammer, then fatally stabbed her with a butcher knife, claiming that a voice told him to kill her. She returned from dinner and an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting around 11 o'clock. He killed her right away. He struck her with a hammer, knocking her to the ground. He stabbed her through the heart several times. It wasn't until after his arrest for second-degree murder that Gordon was diagnosed with schizophrenia. Gordon was sentenced to 16 years to life in prison with the possibility of parole. However, he was denied parole several times after not attending any of the hearings, and remained in prison until his death. The following year, he was interviewed for an extensive report in Rolling Stone, in which he described the voices he'd heard in his head for most of his life, and said that he'd had no interest in killing his mother, but was being guided like a zombie. Gordon recalled, "When I remember the crime, it's kind of like a dream. I can remember going through what happened in that space and time, and it seems kind of detached, like I was going through it on some other plane. It didn't seem real." The minute Jim was arrested, the entire world turned their back on him. Gordon was serving 16 years to life for his mother's murder when he and Clapton won a Grammy for Layla. His achievement went uncelebrated. The man who had co-written one of rock's most beloved songs sat in a prison psychiatric ward while the awards rolled in. As recently as 2018, still diagnosed with schizophrenia, Gordon was denied parole again. He died of natural causes on March 13, 2023, at age 77. He spent the last 4 decades of his life behind bars. Immediately after his death, there was an entire change of attitude in the world. No longer was Jim this guy who killed his mother. He was somebody who had been severely mentally ill. He started to get a bit of the compassion that he had never received before. Jim had to die to be forgiven. The tragedy of Jim Gordon is not simply a story about a musician who killed someone. It is a story about a system that failed to recognize a catastrophic illness in a man who for years was crying out for help in ways nobody understood. We close with a story that blurs the line between guilt and innocence, between crime and catastrophe. Keith Moon was the wildest drummer in rock history, a human wrecking ball whose off-stage antics were as legendary as his performances with The Who. But on January 4, 1970, in a pub car park in Hatfield, Hertfordshire, England, Moon's recklessness cost a man his life. The Who drummer Keith Moon was cleared of all drunk driving charges. Following the death of his chauffeur and bodyguard, 24-year-old Cornelius, known as Neil Boland, in 1970. The circumstances of that night, however, were far from clear-cut. Moon had gone out to a pub with his wife Kim and several friends. As the evening wore on, a group of skinheads outside the pub turned hostile. When Moon and his entourage attempted to leave, the situation erupted into violence. Moon tried to escape in his Bentley after the angry mob of skinheads attacked him as he left the bar. The mob tried to overturn the car, and in the commotion, Boland left the vehicle, leaving Moon to take the wheel. Boland either then stumbled or was forced in front of the car and was crushed under the wheels. The scene was pandemonium, a mob surrounding a Bentley, fists and boots hammering against the doors and windows, screaming voices, and a panicked rock star at the wheel of a car he shouldn't have been driving. In the chaos, his chauffeur and bodyguard ended up under the wheels. Neil Boland, a man whose entire job was to keep Keith Moon safe, was killed by the person he was hired to protect, despite Moon pleading guilty to drunk driving, driving without a license, and driving without insurance. All 3 charges were dropped. The judge told Moon, "You had no choice but to act the way you did, and no moral culpability is attached to you." Those close to the rock star revealed that he suffered from nightmares following the incident for the rest of his life. The legal system absolved Keith Moon of responsibility. A mob had attacked his car. He had tried to flee. It was, by the court's determination, a tragic accident born out of circumstances beyond his control. But the emotional weight of that night never left him. People who knew Moon said the incident changed something fundamental inside him. That behind the jokes and the hotel room demolitions and the theatrical madness, there was a man haunted by the image of his friend disappearing beneath the wheels of his own car. Moon didn't speak publicly about Boland's death. He rarely addressed it in interviews, but the nightmares persisted. And those closest to him knew the toll it took. The drummer who could make 20,000 people lose their minds with a drum fill was privately tormented by a single moment of panic and chaos that he could never undo. In 1978, Moon died aged 32 after swallowing 32 clomethazole tablets, which are used for treating alcohol withdrawal symptoms. His life ended in the same swirl of excess and self-destruction that had defined it. Whether the death of Neil Boland contributed to the downward spiral that ultimately killed Keith Moon is impossible to say with certainty. But the timeline speaks for itself. After that night in Hatfield, something shifted, and the man who seemed indestructible on stage was quietly falling apart off it. 5 cases, 5 deaths, a drunk driving accident on Sunset Strip, a stabbing in a crumbling Manhattan hotel, a premeditated assault in a Norwegian apartment, a schizophrenic episode in a California living room, a chauffeur crushed in a Hertfordshire car park. Each of these events unfolded in a different decade, a different country, and a different corner of the rock and roll universe. But they share something in common. They remind us that the people behind the music, the ones we put on stages and on posters and on pedestals, are capable of the same acts of violence, recklessness, and destruction as anyone else. Some of these men walked free. Vince Neil served 20 days. Keith Moon was cleared entirely. Varg Vikernes served 15 years of a 21-year sentence and now lives as a free man in France. Others were not so fortunate. Jim Gordon spent 40 years in a prison psychiatric facility before dying behind bars. Sid Vicious never made it to trial. Heroin finished the job before the courts could. What binds these stories together is not just death. It is the uncomfortable truth that fame, talent, and public adoration have never been a shield against human darkness. And in some cases, they may have made it worse. The money that bought Vince Neil his freedom, the scene that enabled Varg Vikernes' extremism, the industry that ignored Jim Gordon's deteriorating mental health because he could still play the drums, the mythology that turned Sid and Nancy into punk rock Romeo and Juliet. Instead of 2 deeply troubled young people who needed help, these are the rock stars who killed people. Their music endures, so do the consequences.